part of what these folk who say, I'm not actively prejudiced, I'm not actively racist, what they do is that they stand by silently in a world in which race continues to organize inequality. So it's like saying, I'm not actively trying to put Jews in ovens, but I'm standing by silently as they're being put in ovens. I'm not actively racist, but I live in the city of New Orleans that produced the context that Katrina washed up. I'm not actively racist, but I'm standing by as 2.3 million folk are incarcerated, right? 60% of them are black folk and brown folk. I'm not actively racist, but I'm watching schools in urban and rural districts not educating children, not educating them at all, warehousing them, right? I'm not actively racist as I watch the economy reorganize itself and drive particular populations into jobs where they can't, even though they're working 40 and 60 hours a week, they can't pay rent and feed themselves at the same time. Right? Right. When he broke the seal in the temple, what did he say? He didn't say he was coming here just to affirm the heart. Right? It was a transformation of the very quality of what it meant to be a human being in the world.
In terms of whether racism was wrong and worth taking a stand against, I always knew that, I guess. But I really didn't think it was a problem for a long time. And even when I would hear African American friends talk about it, and even sometimes when I saw them go through things, somehow I still thought, okay, the civil rights movement took care of this. It's not really a problem. It was when I began to realize that it really was still a problem, and that there was a lot that I didn't know, and just because I hadn't experienced it didn't mean it didn't happen.
Outrage at loud, or as Ta-Nehisi Coates said, outrage at crude racist is easy. They're just a collateral effect of long-standing indifference to black suffering. Outrage about that suffering is hard because it requires us to track power and domination. It requires us to track the movement of capital.
To simply say, isn't it terrible the way in which Mr. Sterling of the basketball team, the Los Angeles Clippers, isn't it terrible that he's a racist? Oh, I heard so much piety over the airwaves. He was a racist, he was a racist, he was a racist. He is a racist. But the implication of those who are doing the condemning is that we're not like he is. Maybe we're not as extreme in our conversation. Maybe we're not as despicable in what has come out of our mouths. But the reality is, there's something we are afraid to talk about. There is yet to be an honest discussion of race in America. And may I add, there is yet to be an honest discussion on race within the church.
The evangelical wing of the church during the 1950s and 60s, all the way up to the end of the 1970s, is that in our reaction to the liberals and this whole fundamentalist liberal controversy that took place in the middle part of the 20th century, where we had to clarify what our theology was and what the truth of the scriptures taught about the atonement of Christ, the authority of scripture, all of those things, we went to the other extreme and we abdicated our social consciousness because we put that over to where the liberals were. And then we began to export our brand of a privatized Christianity because we were scared of the moniker social gospel.
But there is a sense that for evangelical Protestants in particular, for white evangelicals, who are so passionately committed to their faith, who are strong believers in the building blocks of the faith, that there's this idea of brotherhood and humanity in Christianity, but there seems to be limits on that when it comes to African Americans and limits on that when it comes to issues of race.
So that African Americans, even now, 60, 70 years after the beginnings of the civil rights movement, still have every reason, or many reasons, to feel a heritage of exclusion and bitterness and denial, which is very hard to come to terms with, especially because American idealism and American values emphasize human equality. Obviously, Jim Crow is a standing violation of the idea of equality, and it's probably the greatest problem that America's got to come to terms with.
So before he died, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. argued that there was an ultimate goal, and that is the beloved community. And Dr. King described the beloved community. He wasn't the first person to create this idea, by the way, but he was sort of the person who most developed the idea of the beloved community. And what Dr. King was saying is that the beloved community is this spiritually based gathering. People of all walks of life sort of come in and we celebrate in the fellowship of humanity. But he argued that the biggest hurdle to the beloved community was the idea that of racial inequality, that getting to know one another and spending more time together is not going to happen unless race relations progress. And the way that race relations progress is on some level through government involvement, that laws change, that there are more initiatives that are in play to help more minorities experience the milk and honey, to help them achieve their American dreams. This beloved community is not really going to come into fruition. It's great that we start to get to know each other, but we're only going to get to a certain point with that we've got to get on the other side through government involvement, through more political involvement, that government sort of just can't stand on the sidelines and we're just going to let race relations evolve on their own sake in time. He was saying, no, we've got to manipulate race relations. We've got to push things forward, that if we really want to have a fellowship of humanity, that we have got to get more involved to make things happen, which brings about equality, which brings about a beloved community.
A critical difference between white evangelical churches and the black church comes with regard to the role of the state. A really important part of white American evangelical theology has been a suspicion of government, a desire for a smaller, less intrusive government in a whole host of areas. That's not characteristic of the black church. Black church has very often seen government as a partner in the civil rights struggle, in the desire to ameliorate poverty. And so there's much more willingness in black churches to embrace and welcome and, in fact, to ask for government intervention and government solutions that you just don't see among white evangelical Christians. So that's a pretty fundamental divide. So while black and white evangelicals will tend to be on the same page with regard to issues like abortion, homosexuality, school prayer, the range of what we would call the moral issues, they are going to part company dramatically when it comes to questions of economic policy. The African American church has embraced and advocated for a vastly expanded welfare state and social safety net in the United States. White evangelical churches have been extremely resistant to the idea of a broader government safety net, a broader, more expansive welfare state.
See, I think even those evangelical Christians who say they are not concerned about social issues like race, deal with the heart, get the heart changed, takes care of race. Those same Christians would not say that about abortion. They are very much involved in a movement against abortion. They don't like the Supreme Court's decision about Roe v. Wade. And they have been active in trying to change that. Not only that, but the Tea Party itself is a very active social movement. Many evangelical Christians are a part of that movement. See, people don't be concerned about social issues often that do not affect them. They often are concerned about social issues that do affect them. So whites are concerned about, now they weren't, as long as whites are in charge of everything, then Christian faith is about the heart. But when something in the society happens that affects them, they are equally concerned about those social issues. You can see that with abortion. You can see that with all other kind of evangelical issues. It's no accident that most evangelicals are Republicans. And they are strong Republicans. They just don't want you concerned about race because they want to keep the society pretty much the same as it is with white people dominating everything. And as long as that's going on, they said, no, Christianity is about the heart. And if you solve the heart, you'll solve race. They don't say that about abortion now.
So when you think about African American denominationalism, right, it has everything to do with kind of the religious and political history of the United States, right? I mean, one thing that we can say is that you can tell the political history of the United States through its religious history, and you can tell the religious history of the United States through its political history, right? They're so intimately connected. And what you see with separation of church and state is a kind of proliferation of denominationalism, right? And African Americans in particular, right, play an interesting role in this regard.
Hey, all right. Hey, what's going on over there? All right now, all right. Hey.
Good morning, Christ community. Good morning, Christ community. Good morning. Today is the Lord's day. Are we excited to be in the Lord's house? Who gets the praise today? Who should get the praise every day? Amen. Let's stand as we sing every praise, because every praise belongs to who? Amen.
To really get at the roots of racial reconciliation, we sort of have to take another step back, and that is sort of ideological differences between Americans overall. There's this ideological war that's been going on here for quite some time, and it's these two warring positions, the idea of individualism on one end and structuralism on the other end. Individualism is the dominant American ideology. It's the idea that if you work hard, the fruits of your labors will pay off, that the milk and honey is there for you if you do your part. On the other side of the equation, there's the structuralist position that says that, yeah, even though I get up in the morning and I go to work, that education, for example, may not pay off for me the same way it does for others. Structuralism is the idea that there's racism, there's classism, there's poverty, there's, in general, inequality that stops some people or limits the success for some groups of people over others. Because what we see, for example, is that white evangelicals are more strongly committed to the individualist ethic than average everyday whites in the U.S. Blacks, on the other hand, are on the structural side. And black Protestants are far more structural than even black folks who aren't Protestants.
I think we have to have a structural approach to social issues, but particularly the work of social justice within the church. Nothing can be done actually on the very individualistic level. The individual may have a calling, the individual may have a passion, the individual may feel very drawn to any particular social justice issue, but it takes an entire community, it takes an entire village, it takes an entire congregation and their commitment to a social issue. If we're going to see any transformation in the prison industrial complex, if we're going to see transformation in terms of an equitable education within the African American communities, it's going to take a structural approach that involves an entire congregation or many people committed.
People can say it's about the heart, I'm not this, I'm not that, but the world is organized in a particular sort of way, right? Where people who are created in the likeness of God are being treated, right? Who are living lives of just straight up misery and being blamed for. It's not to say that people don't make bad choices, right? I know I'm preaching, but it is not to say that people don't make bad choices. It's the point that people don't account for folks' lives in total by way of those bad choices, right? You see what I mean? That's what bothers me about a certain way of accounting for the misery of black communities, is that it's a culture of pathology.
We're kind of looking at the outcome, and then we're arguing that because of the outcome, therefore, they must not have had the motivation. But another assumption that's being made is that because people do well, they did well because they were motivated to do so. But that's not necessarily the case, right? That people can be not particularly motivated and end up doing really well in life because they've had a lot of opportunity to do well. And so if you are living in a community where you don't have a lot of resources, you go to a reasonable school that's not doing really well, maybe, in fact, your school has been pulled out of your neighborhood, which happens when resources dry up, right, in cities and in communities. And that's really your only resource. And you go to the school and it's not the best school. You end up hanging out with other people who also don't have a lot of resources, and they don't know a lot about how to, for example, get into college. Or how to, for example, apply for a job, or how to learn about the best neighborhood to live in, right? I mean, we kind of, this is the thing, we kind of think that we have done something to get all this information. But most of the time, it's not as if we went out to the library when we were like 10 years old or 15 years old and looked up all this stuff, right? Looked up, well, what do I need to do well in life? That we somehow just caught that information. And we caught that information because of the people we were around, right? But that had nothing to do with you as an individual. That had to do with where you were located in a social structure. And so when we tie outcomes to the individual without looking at the social structure, we are really missing a large part of the story. We are not gathering a good understanding of how society works, and then how society affects what people do, what their opportunities are, what their ultimate decisions will be. And if we're going to look at somebody or a group of people who are disproportionately on welfare, for example, then we also need to look at people who are disproportionately doing well, right? Why are they doing well? What's open for them that's not open for other people?
Well, I think it's very important to have individual responsibility. But I think you have individuals in all communities who are irresponsible. And you got individuals in all communities who are very responsible. In the black community, you can be as responsible as you want to. But if the social structures are so systemic, there ain't no way you can get out of the situation you find yourself in.
What this comes back to is that for whites in general, it comes back to the emphasis on individualism. Whites will say, in the minds of whites, and when I say this, I'm talking in terms of survey research, whites are more likely to say, hey, look, you know, you're black and you have every chance to make it if you work hard, if you do your part. And if you work hard and you do your part, I'm going to look out for you to help you, person to person, individual to individual. Whereas we as African Americans are seeing things more in a group context, right? We're seeing that our history binds us together. So what we want to see happen is that there's less of a focus on you and and more of a focus on all of us. And this is where we get to this question of laws. And this is where we get to this question of policies towards groups of people. I do think that there is this question, this focus on individualism that's important, that sort of underlies this ideology of American, who we are as a nation, what are the driving principles of success that get in the way.
Well, in white evangelical Protestantism, there's a very strong theology of self-reliance that says that people should be responsible for themselves. And to the extent that people can't take care of themselves, the responsibility should fall on the church community, the neighborhood, the small civic association to care for those who are in need. There's a real wariness of government because government is godless in the view of white evangelicals. Government is the secular state that will, in its programs, tend to impose secular values that will often be at odds with the ethos of the church. And so this undergirds a lot of the white evangelical skepticism about government programs. Within the African American church, there is much less of this skepticism because African Americans look to the history of government involvement in things like the New Deal, the Civil Rights Act, and their view is that government action has been a critical part of the story of black advancement, black empowerment in America. And so that creates a very distinct set of preferences that are very different from what white evangelicals bring to the table.
What we need to recognize is that people do make individual choices around their health and how they live their lives, but they also make those individual choices in the context of a larger society, a larger community that helps provide or doesn't help provide opportunities and resources for us to make those individual choices. So they come together. They come together not as an excuse, but as a community, as a city, as a state, as a region, as a nation, on, to provide a fabric that we live within as individuals. And as we also see what are the opportunities out there for us? What are the choices? When we give people a limited range of choices, they choose from that limited range. The more we can expand those choices, the more people have the opportunity to make other choices, perhaps better choices, perhaps worse choices. It's hard to know. We have this thing called free will, so we have to be our own moral barometers in that regard.
For 350 years, it was structurally designed for black people to be marginalized and dominated. Then suddenly, you get a Voting Rights Act and a Civil Rights Act. That doesn't change anything significantly. Not after you spent 3.5 centuries dominating and exploiting black people and making sure that they didn't get an education. Then you're going to blame them because they don't measure up to the group that did the dominating? That's crazy.
The whole damn system is guilty as hell. Indict, convict, send that killer cop to jail. The whole damn system is guilty as hell. Indict, convict, send that killer cop to jail.
The whole damn system is guilty as hell. Indict, convict, send that killer cop to jail. The whole damn system is guilty as hell. Indict.
So the issue is, who is it that asks the question? Who is it that defines how we live? See, when black people miss the boat, they always say it's our fault. Black people's fault. Why don't they do better? When white people miss it and go off track, they say, well, what did we not do? Come on, you doctors, psychiatrists, and all of you other, come on and help us out and explain why they did what they did at Columbine. Now, they can kill black people all the time in Chicago or somewhere like that. They ain't gonna ask, so what did we do? They just so said, well, those colored folks down there, they are not responsible. They don't have good daddies, and the mamas don't take care of them. That's what they do when they want to justify the segregation and the exploitation in this society. If a young black person can get through teenage years and through the 20s without going to jail, they have achieved a major accomplishment. It's obvious if the outcome of blacks are so markedly different, something must be wrong. If you had as many white people in prisons, percentage-wise, as you have black people in prison, this country would just declare a state of emergency. They would have all kinds of prison studies, and they'd try to figure out what's wrong is happening here.
You're not so much dealing at that point, I don't think, with just a problem of race, of African Americans deal more with the social issue. I think it's a lot more of context, geographical context in which you find yourself. Your ministry takes on the flavor of the needs that are demonstrated in that particular context. Now that is not to justify in any way at all the lack of emphasis on justice that we find among many white evangelicals. That's not to justify that at all. But it is to say that I think it's a little bit of an unfair criticism to say that because your church is in, say, where we are in Roswell, Georgia, and we're not immersed in poverty and issues, that then therefore say, well, you don't care about justice issues. That's not necessarily true. There's a lot of stuff that these churches who are located in these suburban communities, they're doing in terms of partnerships and the direction of resources and the empowerment of people and stuff that really is a reflection of justice and of caring for the community.
For Christianity to ultimately show its merit, its value, its ultimate sense of brotherhood and faith among human beings, you've got to resolve the issue of racial inequality. And so for Cone, as well as a great number of others, this is a problem. That the fact that you have the two primary groups of Protestants in the United States, blacks and whites, this long history that goes back in the U.S. for several centuries, and they are at completely opposite poles in terms of their politics, in terms of the way that they live out their faith. So reconciliation is critical to this.
And then the Exodus of Sharon is a cattle. And it says the cattle of 1,000 hills belongs to the Lord. What I want you to see is that the end result shall be the glory of God. And that's why we live in God's glory. We receive God's glory.
Black churches emerge as the most important civic site, right? Because they're locked out in so many other domains. Economically locked in, politically locked out, demographically, the movement, right? Policed. So the cultural domain becomes the most important site for black self-creation, right? This is why the sound, that sonic agency, right, is so crucial, right? And churches become this crucial space because it's controlled for the most part by us. It's the place that affirms, Dick Gregory told me the story. It was in that bulletin in the church that someone told, that the community found out that he did well in school. It was in the church that I gave my first public speech, right? It was in this space that people who worked under conditions in which their humanity was constantly under siege, that they acquired some sense of dignity. And so it's not just simply faith, right? It's social arrangements and the affirmation of humanity in these social spaces.
If God is about equality and about justice for all, and yet we're a world structured by inequality, and it's marked by injustice, the demands of God's justice and the demands of God's righteousness becomes an ethical motivating factor, a kind of moral imperative. It places a certain moral imperative upon the Christian to engage that world of inequality, right? And so one way to read it is inequality, the admission of inequality basically would sort of tie our hands, right, religiously, right? We'd have to throw away the idea of God, right? And so if we don't want to throw away the idea of God, the other side of that, politically and morally and ethically, we become immobilized. We can't do anything because we can't admit that the world is broken. The stuff that we've built, it's not right, and we need to rebuild it, right? We need to tear this down and rebuild something else. We don't want to go there, right? Because of all of the implications that will come out of that. Our notions of God aren't up to snuff, right? The other side that I've tried to suggest is to say, no, it could actually become that which gives us a certain kind of moral imperative to engage the world, right? On the basis that God don't like it the way it is, right? On the basis that God reads it as broken against the backdrop of God's imperative for equality and justice.
This thing has been going on since 5 o'clock and is still going strong. All of people are lining up their voices, wanting to be heard. There are more than well.
I've been around African American people enough to know this, that one of the problems that they have to deal with, which is distinctly their problem, is they have to see beyond their victimized state. Now, that's very important. The reason why it's so hard to do is because they are victims. But the minute that you define yourself as a victim, you become powerless. Because then the possibility for improvement always is in the hands of the victimizer. You did this to us, and unless you change, we're going to be oppressed for the rest of our lives. In this respect, do you understand why the Black Muslim movement has such an attraction for young people? Because the guys like Farrakhan come along and say to black young people, if your success and future is dependent on the graciousness of white people, you lose before you even begin. You have to understand that whether you make it in this world or don't make it in this world has everything to do with you, and forget about them giving you something. In this respect, my African American students who are attracted to this stuff say that's why we like Farrakhan more than we like Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson's always trying to get concessions from white people.
Mainstream civil rights movement like Jesse Jackson or whoever else you name, they are not, let me just say this, they are not asking white people to do anything. We pay taxes. If we pay taxes just like white people, it's ours too. We pay taxes for schools, we pay taxes for resources, we pay taxes in New York. They just happen to pick up garbage down on Fifth Avenue downtown, and they won't pick it up on Fifth Avenue uptown. They don't pick up garbage in the black community, even though we pay taxes too. So it's not a matter of white people helping us or us asking white people. It is insisting that this government, this nation, be a just nation and do for all of its people the same as it does for white people. That's all. We don't want any special handout. We don't want no special gifts. We just want justice. That's all.
African Americans after the Civil War if they could vote at all, nearly always voted Republican, because the Republicans were the party of Abraham Lincoln who'd freed the slaves. So from the 1860s through to the 1930s, most African Americans who could vote, although many of them couldn't because of Jim Crow laws, but those who could vote voted Republican, because that was Lincoln's party. But in the 1930s, at the time of the New Deal, there's a big switch in African American voting behavior, and more African Americans go over to the party of Franklin Roosevelt, because they believed that his New Deal programs and policies were good for them, that they were more likely to get a sympathetic hearing from the Democrats than they were from the Republicans. And that's remained true from then really right up to the present.
The Democratic Party wisely with LBJ, when LBJ came out with the Great Society program, when he put that, made it a law and put it into effect, one of the things that he is, I should say, reputed or renowned to have said, I will now have these blankety blanks, and he used the N-word, on my side forever. So the Democratic Party got smart. They knew that if they wanted political power, because you had JFK and he was amazing, and then you had LBJ and he was amazing in terms of, because they had charisma. And you had on the other side, you had boring people like Goldwater, you know, who could even talk a refrigerator into being cold. Adlai Stevenson, Democrat, but you had some boring people. So the Democratic Party, to its credit, saw the victimization, and they saw the evils that had been pushed upon African Americans, and they look upon African Americans as a voting bloc. Now, not all of us, not all African Americans vote monolithically, but we vote in a group in the urban quarter cities.
When sort of taken, you know, in the aggregate, when trying to think across a complex of issues and to think in terms of the options politically that are available to us, I think that, you know, the Democrat Party has been the party that, more than the Republican Party, has tried to take seriously the things that black churches try to take seriously. Voting, things to ensure jobs, more jobs and opportunities, things that would try to uphold the social safety net, whether we're talking about health care, whether we're talking about the availability of unemployment benefits if one finds themselves in the position of being unemployed. These, I think, tend to be matters that the Democrat Party has been more aligned with the needs and the interests of black church folk.
So what we're talking about is not the political orientation of the institution, of a homogeneous institution. What we're talking about is political orientation of black people, the people who sit in the pews. And what we know is that when you control for race, right, that black folk are some of the most conservative people in the United States, even though we tend to vote Democratic, right? But when you control for race on the so-called values question, right, black voters tend to the only other population of, you know, that come close to the conservatism of black Christians are Mormons. That's how far right we go, right, in this instance. And we saw the kind of interesting coalition between Mormons and black Christians and black churches in particular, right, with the proposition around banning same-sex marriage in California.
So that tension where African American churches on one hand seem very conservative, on the other hand they seem very deeply socially liberal, right? And that tension, I think, is a reflection of the tension and the double consciousness of African American life, right? So there is a deep conservatism, there is a deep, you know, belief in a very kind of conservative theological belief, a very orthodox kind of Christianity. There is sort of a deep belief that the individual as a sinner saved by grace and what he or she can achieve with the help of Christ, right? But there is also the reality of the everyday situation in which African Americans find themselves with, dealing with these structural forces of oppression. And so you see that tension within the African American church. Absolutely socially way far more liberal, right, than their white evangelical counterparts, even at the same time as they continue to affirm some of the more conservative tenets of the white evangelical church. That tension is the tension in which African Americans live. They believe deeply in the power of people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They believe deeply in the ability for people to work really hard and succeed, but they also deal with the reality of no matter how hard people work, no matter how people try to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, they're still living in a world that views them as somehow inferior or somehow lesser than because of their race.
One of my greatest concerns is that I'm from a generation in which we saw the rise and dominance of the federal government in terms of caring for the needs of our communities. Well, and that's a wonderful thing, by the way. The Bible teaches that the government exists for the welfare of the people. On the other hand, I think we abdicated our personal responsibility.
They always tell people in the lower class, I'm talking about in terms of socioeconomics, I'm not putting them down, who don't utilize the system to its fullest. And they tell their folk, it's not your fault that you're using crack. It's not your fault that your son did this, this, and this and is a criminal. It's the evil white man or the evil system. And they teach what I call private victimization. Every negative thing that you do to hurt yourself, they tie it to the white man or the racist industrial system in some shape, fashion, or form.
We do know that there was an amazing shift in the frame of how Americans thought of inequality, how we thought of racial disparity in the country. It has everything to do with the Reagan Revolution of 1980, but it can be pushed back to the 60s and 70s, which has everything to do with the ascendance of a certain kind of neoliberalism or neoliberal market logic, right, which begins to assume that state intervention on behalf of those who are most vulnerable actually distorts and undermines, the market. And then it requires a kind of onslaught, an ideological push to insist that those who are actually the most vulnerable are actually responsible for their vulnerability. So what you see between the late 70s and it gets sediments into common sense by the 80s is the privatization of social misery, right? So we go from a concern around inequality to questions of personal responsibility, to discourses around family, to ideas of choice and competition and the entrepreneur and producers and those who are aspiring towards a certain standard of living. And so then what you get is this characterization of the poor, this characterization of the black poor in particular, as being responsible for their own condition, when we know that much of the inequality that we experience today, is deeply rooted in the legacy of white supremacy. I mean, how else are we to think about wealth inequality, right? That's inheritable differences, right? That has little to nothing to do with the fact that I'm not working hard. I'm not wealthy, even though I'm a professor at Princeton. Has everything to do with it. I'm a first generation, college student, which has everything to do with the fact that my mother and father grew up in Jim Crow, Mississippi, which has everything to do with the fact that their mother and father encountered deep-seated structural racism, so this idea that we're post-racial makes no sense, ideologically. I mean, it makes sense ideologically in terms of it fits perfectly with a certain conception of capitalism in this moment. But it makes no sense when we look at the data, By every statistical measure of quality of life, black folk are catching hell. Brown folk are catching hell, every statistical measure. Since 2008, we've experienced a Great Black Depression. A large segment of black America has fallen into the shadows as people have celebrated the ascendance of our first black president. But it's under his watch and the watch of all the black liberals who have supported him that all untold misery has engulfed our communities. We haven't seen this kind of loss of wealth in black America since the collapse of the Freedmen's Bank.
At the same time that what we've seen among white voters, and particularly among religiously observant white voters, is a progressive movement in the direction of the Republican Party, more and more strongly so over time. So there is a very, very strong racial divide among church-going Americans along lines of race.
There are a few problems with evangelicals and politics in the U.S. I mean, one is that there's a stereotype that some people have fed, and I don't know, maybe I won't mention their names, but you know, with the moral majority and things like that, there were certain issues that they took a stand on, or the Christian Coalition, the religious right took stands on certain kinds of issues. And one time, actually, a certain speaker from the religious right was speaking to a group of African American Christians, and I was there, and he argued for, you know, the rightness of certain things that most of us agreed with. But then they opened it up for questions, and I said, why is it that you take a certain position on you know, against gun control? How are those specifically Christian positions? And why don't you speak out on issues that don't fit your partisan affiliation? It almost looks to me like you don't want to be prophetic. You don't want to speak about God's righteousness and truth on everything. You just want to speak it where it fits the party platform of the party that you're talking about.
Jimmy Carter was elected as president in 1976, and he said, I'm a born-again Christian. He was a Sunday school teacher. He believed very strongly in his personal salvation as a Christian. But because he belonged to the Democratic Party, which in those days was also the party which favored women's rights, was the pro-choice party on the abortion question, a lot of conservative evangelicals turned against the Democrats and joined organizations like the Moral Majority of the late 1970s. This was Jerry Falwell's group, which said, we're witnessing a transformation of America which is making it more immoral. They said the traditional family is breaking down, feminism is encouraging women to do things different from being wives and mothers. The contraception is spreading, pornography is spreading, abortion is spreading. All these things are horrible violations of America's Christian traditions. And this organization, the Moral Majority, was one of those which stood strongly behind Reagan when he was the Republican candidate in 1980, and obviously helped him to win.
White evangelicals need to be very careful that they don't assume that because one is Republican, that they are authentically biblical in everything that they say and do. And the same thing with black Christians. We typically tilt toward the Democratic side. And I say that the Word of God stands in judgment over every single thing, and it's time that we began to criticize, judge, critique everything about everything based upon what that book says, and not based upon what our background or some powerful individual or our favorite candidate or letting somebody else do the thinking for us.
Evangelicals have certainly over the last 30 to 40 years really focused on working for just laws as they see it, trying to transform the political order. But historically, that's actually out of character for white evangelicals. That is, for most of American history, white evangelicals were not especially politically active compared to other groups. And especially in the mid-20th century, that was kind of a low ebb of evangelical political activism. That got really reinvigorated in the 1970s, 1980s, with Jerry Falwell, the Moral Majority, then the Christian Coalition. White evangelicals really aggressively engaged politics and tried to use politics as a forum for transforming law and society in a direction that was in keeping with their vision of the gospel. Now I think there's a bit of a reevaluation of that. A lot of white evangelicals are starting to say, is engagement with politics really worth it? That is this the best way to build the kingdom of God? And so I think there's a lot of kind of introspection going on with regard to that question.
I hate talking about white and black churches in this regard because, you know, at a certain point, I wonder if God is not weeping. I wonder if he's not weeping. But, you know, because of the racialized history we have, that's how these strains came about. And but the white church has bypassed a lot of the social justice issues, particularly the evangelical wing of the church. And then all of a sudden we discovered, or they discovered, social issues in a lot of part of the 70s and got involved in the political process. But the problem with that is that they come across very disingenuous because it smells like the selective denunciation of sin. And so black Christians say, okay, you discover this now, you're all ticked off that they're taking prayer out of school, you're angry about, abortion, and rightly so, it's murder, and I use all of those kind of stuff, and you're upset about this, and you don't like this thing, and you don't like Obamacare, and you don't like this kind of thing. But where were you in the 60s when dogs were biting people in Birmingham, and black folks were being pinned to the ground with water hoses, and they were beating our brains out over the bridge there in Selma, Alabama? What did you have a word from God? Did you have a word? I say that not to guilt anyone. And so what I am saying right now, what I would say to both white and black churches, actually, I think the Church of Jesus Christ, this new day, that we don't need to be bullied by heritage, right? And we don't need to let some powerful white figures tell us how to think. We need to let the Bible tell us how to think. We need to let justice roll down. We need to call sin sin. And we don't need to contaminate Jesus.
You can't make a generalization about the white church because you're dealing with one sector of the white church, a very politically conservative section of the white church. And they drift over to the Republican Party. And they are really embracing values that belong to the 20th century, to the middle of the 20th century. It's not just that these people over the extreme right have negative feelings on race. They will deny it. They will say our animosity towards Obama has nothing to do with race. You got to be kidding. Of course it does. It may be a residue. It may be suppressed, but there's a racial factor there. But there's more to it than that. And that is that they're harking back to another time. A time when gays were oppressed and weren't allowed to even speak their name. So they're not just anti-African American, or they're not only have racist issues. As a matter of fact, that's the least of their problems. They have attitudes towards women. They have attitudes towards gays. They have a lot of attitudes out there.
Some of it is a stereotype, but it's a stereotype that some evangelicals have perpetuated and generated to begin with. And some of it is that there are a lot of evangelicals who really do think those ways.
Gandhi was right when he said, everybody knows what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount, except for Christians. That's a powerful statement. But can you read the Sermon on the Mount and come away as anything other than somebody committed to nonviolent resistance? Nonviolent resistance. Martin Luther King reads the Sermon on the Mount, and he has to go and listen to Gandhi. He's a seminary graduate. Why did he have to go to Gandhi to learn what the Sermon on the Mount was all about? Because the conservative evangelicals do not, in fact, take the Sermon on the Mount seriously.
Actually, there was one setting in a small group where my pastor from Orange Grove was talking about ethnic reconciliation. And at the end we were praying, and I felt like the Holy Spirit gave me a prophecy. And it was the Lord's speaking with just such pain, saying, my body has been torn apart. And I could actually feel the pain in my own heart of his body being torn. He wants us to be one, and it hurts him when we're not. I don't know if you're allowed to keep the part about the prophecy, because it depends on who your target audience is, but
I think, it would be wonderful, right, to have churches that are profoundly integrated to kind of experience what Howard Thurman was doing in the 40s, right, in San Francisco, in a substantive and in a substantive way, not just simply in a symbolic way. So I'm not denying the merit of multi-ethnic churches, but I am resisting the demand that somehow we leave behind the specificity of these cultural institutions. There's always the demand, let's call it the assimilation demand, right? That black folk somehow have to give up something in order to be accepted. And that something is that we have to leave the particulars of who we are at the door. James Baldwin wrote about this in Many Thousands Gone, that we have to become blank, right? And when we are blank, we wash away the guilt, right? So we have to leave the specificity of our journey behind so that folk can feel good about themselves. I don't want to go through all of that. That's nonsense to me. But that's not to say that genuine fellowship across racial and ethnic difference, across class differences, is it a value that we should have?
There are certain instances where white churches of mainline denominations are more than willing to accept African American people into the congregation, providing, here's the word, they're the quote unquote right kind of African Americans. But take a good look at who they are. One happens to be a doctor. One happens to be a very wealthy industrialist. Another is a lawyer, and another is a dentist. In short, if they're upper middle class, there's no problem. If they're educated, if they're sophisticated. But they have trouble accepting African American people if they do not fall into that elite category. Now, one can argue, isn't it true, Tony, that churches tend to attract people of similar socioeconomic backgrounds? And the fact that these people are black or white makes no difference as long as they're at the same educational, social, and economic level as the other members of the church. That's a good argument, and it can be made. It's one that doesn't do away with the fact that there still is a lot of racism inherent in those churches.
What we've seen in the past for a certain segment of the church, and the first segment I want to talk about is white Protestants, particularly white evangelicals. We've seen a greater inclination for them to be in line with society in regards to race. That is to say, how society sees race, that has been how white evangelicals have seen race and have dealt with race. Or if they have at least not seen race in that way, at the very least, they didn't challenge how society was working.
Now, it is true, I don't think white preachers are going around saying that white people should dominate black people, like they did, during slavery and also during segregation. But it's already in place. The domination is already in place. You don't have to do anything about it. So when you've been ruling now for 350 years, and suddenly you come and say, let's be friends. On what basis? Friendship is defined by what you do, what you can do together, and what you can struggle with together. I don't think white people believe what they're saying. Because if they believed in the cross, they would not have lynched black people. See, they did to black people what the Romans did to Jesus, and they haven't apologized for that. They haven't said, no, we were wrong about that. Most want to just forget it. Black people can't forget it. You know, if you violate your wife, or your wife violates you, or whoever, or your brother, or your sister, or your mother, or father, if one of them, anybody violates you in a way that whites violated black people, you're not going to be anxious now to go worship with them.
This goes back to the very first point we made. That adjective in front of Christianity matters. Black Christianity, African American Christianity. What is its substance? What makes it matter? It is, at its root, a rejection of the idolatry of white Christianity. Because the adjective on that end matters too. Right? So when you read King's letter from the Birmingham jail, King is doing the same thing that black Christians were doing in slavery. How do you reconcile? How do you reconcile your belief in God with this evil? And what we see throughout the history of the United States is the reconciliation of Christianity with the system of racial domination in each generation, in each iteration, right? So black Christianity emerges as a rejection of the idolatry of whiteness.
When I use the term white privilege, particularly when I'm talking about religious context, I'm using that term to denote people who simply, because of their ethnic or social location, don't have to think about race. They don't have to think about whether or not their needs, their families, their values are going to be represented, because they believe that their values and who they are and what they look like is normative. And anything that is not like them is not normative. So the ways in which white privilege functions in religious spaces in particular are white churches that don't think about issues of race. And so you have newscasters making claims about Jesus's whiteness as if that is a fact, right? As if Jesus was not a first century ethnic Jew growing up in the desert in the region that we now know as Palestine. White privilege allows you to co-opt Jesus so that Jesus has blonde hair and blue eyes and Jesus looks like an American, right? Without dealing with Jesus's historical, racial, and ethnic context. That's an example of white privilege. So those churches don't have to think about race because the entire world is centered around who they are, what they look like, what is normative to them. African Americans are constantly having to insert, constantly having to recontextualize, constantly having to read themselves into spaces that have systematically excluded them.
God created us in his image, and we decided to return the favor. Namely, we create God in our own image. Emil Durkheim began to study a group of Aboriginal people in the interior of Australia, and he watched them go through stages. In the earliest stage of their social economic development, when they were pretty much at a Stone Age level, each tribal unit in Australia developed its own traits and values. Every tribe had its own traits, its own values. That's no surprise. As he watched these people in the interior of Australia, these Aboriginal people, they developed their own traits and values, and little by little they came up with an animal to symbolize the traits and values of the tribe. This tendency to associate the traits of a tribe with an animal is called totemism, from whence we get the word totem pole. The third stage is fascinating. Little by little, over a period of time, the people of the tribe begin to worship the totem, begin to worship the animal, which is nothing more than a symbolic representation of their own traits and values. Now Durkheim raises the question. When you worship this totem, this God, which is nothing more than a symbolic representation of the traits and values of your tribe, when you worship this deity, what are you really worshiping? His answer is, it's the tribe worshiping itself. And I know what the viewers are going to say. They're going to say, yes, that's Aboriginal people, benighted people. We're Americans. We worship Jesus. And here's the question. Tell me about this Jesus that you worship. Because as I hear Jesus being described, as I watch Jesus being presented in religious art, he comes across as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Now that's bad enough, except because we control the ideologies of the culture, we are able to impose our image of Jesus on our African-American brothers and sisters. And so Malcolm X was right when he said, black people end up worshiping a white Jesus. This is the ultimate form of oppression. That in the end, the oppressed are worshiping the oppressor. Don't you see this is the ultimate form of slavery? That's insightful. No wonder the Bible says, make no graven images.
I think also there's a caution there, again, because of the leadership piece. So come and be a part of these churches and sing in these churches and worship in these churches. But in terms of the leadership, in terms of how the church is run, in terms of whose voices get heard, those are often still the voices of the white evangelicals. There's also a particular kind of pernicious way in which the idea is presented to African American churches as if you are welcome to come worship with us, as if this is our space and we are allowing you into our space. But there's always the idea that this is our space in which we are the gatekeepers and we allow you into. That doesn't sit well with many African Americans. And so the African American churches, right, have a distinctive identity, and they don't want to be welcomed into someone else's space when for the past 300, 400 years they've built their own spaces.
When you have a white congregation here and a black congregation here, integration will tend to take place in one direction. The upper level members of the black church will go over to the white church. And so the black church says, the more you talk about racial integration, the more we lose our doctors, our teachers, our financiers, all the elite members of our congregation will tend to be drawn over to the black churches. We don't see the elite in white churches joining black churches.
The church sort of affirming diversity is not particularly countercultural, right? It is in fact quite in line with the rest of society. Maybe some might argue a little bit behind the rest of society, because it still tends to be quite racially and ethnically segregated religious organizations.
Worship is a part of life. It is the way you work out your faith and celebrate it. And it's hard to do that with people who have enslaved you, segregated you, lynched you, put you in prison, and then you want to say, let's go worship together. We have nothing in common because we're not living together. We're not in the same community. And if a significant number of those blacks that they say they want to worship with moved into their community, they would be the first to leave.
The Greeks had a mindset. And the mindset runs like this. The mind is superior to the body. The mind-body dichotomy. The spiritual side, the intellectual side is superior to the physical side. That the physical is inferior, the spiritual intellectual is superior. Eldridge Cleaver makes this point, and it's supported by other sociologists who are more sophisticated in their education. Guys like Davis, guys like Dollard. These are very important sociologists in the field of race relations. That the white community has never had any trouble assigning physical superiority to black people. Since physical is inferior, we have never had any trouble of saying to black people, you're physically superior. But if you're looking for somebody that's intellectual, somebody who can think, you got to get yourself a white man. That's scary. Now let me say loud and clear, all the tests that have been run on IQ will give ample evidence that there is no differentiation between the intelligence of black people and the intelligence of white people. No differentiation whatsoever. It doesn't keep white people from thinking they're intellectually superior. Worse than that, it doesn't keep black people from thinking that white people are intellectually superior. That's even worse.
Blacks and whites practice the faith in very different ways, that blacks are more experiential and whites are more academic. Ultimately, the reason why African Americans are more experiential is because we didn't have access to becoming more academic. That if you're going to have an academic understanding of the faith, if you've got to learn how to read. You have to know how to read at a basic level. Slaves weren't allowed to read. You've got to have access to other information and texts and books in order to think reflexively about your faith. That wasn't the case for blacks.
For 246 years, it was against the law to teach blacks how to read and write. You could go to jail for that. After the Civil War, you still had a society of segregated schools and making sure that black schools are segregated. Now, I went to one of those segregated schools in Arkansas. It was terrible. Now, I got out. I mean, I got out, but you can't blame the ones that didn't get out because they didn't have the resources or the drive or the initiative that I had. Not everybody has the same initiative and drive.
Clearly, there are historically been some really big differences in terms of this academic versus experiential dichotomy, and it is closely related to the legacy of racial inequality in this country. That to become academic, to have an academic understanding, you have to be privileged enough. You have to have access enough to have learned how to read, to have the freedom and access to books to make you challenge what you're thinking about your faith. This may make you a stronger Christian afterwards. This may make you weaker afterwards. But what we see is for whites, this privilege has always been there. For African Americans, we're just now getting to a point where some of us have that privilege. And I would argue that the vast majority of us, or at least a good number of us, do not have that privilege, particularly those who are in that 27 to 29% of us who still remain below the poverty line. How do you develop an academic understanding of Christianity when you attend schools that are quote unquote bad and that you don't have access to the information that you might need to challenge your thought in that sense?
Oh, that my ways were directed to keep your statutes. Then I would not be ashamed when I look into all your commandments. I would praise you with uprightness of heart when I learn of your righteous judgments. I will keep your statutes. Oh, do not forsake me. How can a young man cleanse his way? By taking heed.
Race should matter, right? I don't want to live in a colorblind society. who I am as an African American woman matters to me, and I want it to matter to the world. But I do want to live in a society in which I am treated fairly and justice and not discriminated against or facing oppression because of my race or because of my gender. And so we don't want to move to a colorblind society. I don't want to even move to a post-racial society, but I want to move to a society that is about equity, that is about fairness, that's about real deep consideration and compassion for people's historical, social, and ethnic contexts.
See, you have to, you just can't come together and just sort of celebrate what you wish was. You come together when you live together, when you work together, when you struggle together. When blacks and whites start living together, struggling together, then I said, well, maybe we're getting back beyond this thing. But our communities, white communities, are more segregated now than it was when I was a child.
Please don't shoot me dead, I got my hands above my head. Please don't shoot me dead, I got my hands above my head. Please don't shoot me dead, I got my hands above my head. Please don't shoot me dead, I got my hands above my head. Please don't shoot me dead, I got my hands above my head. Please don't shoot me dead, I got my hands above my head. Please don't shoot me dead, I got my hands above my head. Please don't shoot me dead, I got my hands above my head. Please don't shoot me dead, I got my hands above my head. Please don't shoot me dead, I got my hands above my head. Please don't shoot me dead, I got my hands above my head. Please don't shoot me dead, I got my hands above my head.
So just because someone says, you know, let's just turn to Christ and all this stuff is going to work out, that response was part and parcel of the founding of a racialized society. And so one way to read that response is it can be the voicing of a doubling down on historical ideological uses of Jesus for the making of a racialized and racist society, a society structured by racism. So the question isn't, can we turn to Jesus? The question is, what do you mean by that? And that's where the conversation has to happen.
So there is a way in which, in this country, black folk and white folk have to grapple with the ways in which biblical texts and scripture were used for the enslavement of a group of people. So even though I can believe in this notion of the universal church, this notion of the body of Christ, this notion that people all over the world who call on the name of Christ are part of a continued family, right? I also have to deal fundamentally with the ways in which the biblical text, the ways in which the scripture were used in order to enslave, in order to restrict, in order to silence people of African descent. And because of that difference, I find it very difficult to collapse everyone into the same group. If I'm talking about Jesus and I'm talking about who Christ is to me, but someone like Sarah Palin is talking about Jesus, and she's making the argument that baptism and waterboarding are the same exact thing, then I have to really sit with, for me as a Christian, what does it mean to call someone a fellow Christian when they're talking about torture and baptism in the same sentence? Can we belong to the same group?
We look at society and we think about where society's going, then perhaps we will know where the church is going. And unless the church at some point becomes truly countercultural, and when I say that, I mean sort of generally, more pervasively, there are always segments of the church that are countercultural, that are affirming issues of social justice. That's going on. So what I mean by this, I mean sort of the general sort of direction of the church. If we see that generally the church is kind of affirming society, then I think it's reasonable to expect that it will continue to do so in the future, unless something really major happens. And history suggests that hasn't happened. It shows us that it hasn't happened, and it suggests that it won't happen in the future. So.